Yo, 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 yo! What is going on, CoD Familia? It is your boy BN, aka Mr. Kingdom Builder. And today, first and foremost, happy Thanksgiving to all the lovely peeps out there. Mom, woman, child, baby, non-baby. You guys get it. We're going to be reacting to a video Chiz just put out titled The Future of Super Kingdoms. And this is interesting because I wonder if this is an expanded thought video from conversation that we had in the official COD Discord a couple days ago, where Chiz was firing some shots at people, and there was just a general level of back and forth, and the COD Discord was getting pretty active at that point. And what I'm referring to is where Chiz says the chief has spoken. This was in a response to him giving squiggly eyes at am I tripping or no one from EIS leadership on this list. And the list that Chief responded to was one that Shaw had posted between merits gained. There was some people here. I think this was like total KvK. So you saw like the top 41 players based on the amount of deads that they had accumulated for that KvK specifically. And then there was a number of other things that went on. For example, some of the highlights probably were this one, where it is so funny. You think an alliance should attack and defend at no impossible odds rather than taking a winning fight against an alliance that has failed to properly construct its territory. Right, this one where he's like, I mean, I'm not trash talking, just speaking common sense facts. We have... Oh, yeah, this was an interesting one. I mean, I can't be the only one who noticed the biggest kingdoms taking the easiest fights. This one got a decent bit of reactions. We have another one here, which is you're confusing pre-migration world from post-migration world, two different landscapes entirely, and if you can't see the difference, it's going to be hard to help you. Just bang, bang in the brain. And then we get this one, the experience large kingdoms are having is following exactly how things unfolded in Rock. Global migration opened, massive communities formed that used their size to get easy wins. Then they all died, and real fighter communities emerge and hold top spots for prolonged periods. It's just a question of which kingdoms will actually become the fighter kingdoms. And then the second to last one is to become a fighter community, two things must be true. You take fair but hard fights, potentially even setting the odds slightly against you. These are things we've spoken about before when we looked at the TVT PvP data, comparing KvK groups for who's allying with who, and then looking at those matchups and then potential other matchups that could have played out. Number two, you are not afraid of dead troops and perhaps even require large amounts of dead troops. And then the last one is one where I had commented up here. He says, I mean, I can't be the only one who knows the biggest kingdom trying to take these fights. I said, sadly, there is and has been some truth to this, as the data does not lie when we reviewed matchups and then saw who allied with who in some KvK groups, as unfortunate as it is to say and see. And this is the case because there's been a number of KvK groups where we've looked at PvP T5 data at 60 mil, and then we've looked at it from like 60 to 80 mil, 80 to 100, 100 to, I believe, 125, 125 to 150, 150, 175, and then 200 plus, and looking at like the total amount of T5s, total amount of T5 power from 60 mil and above, and then also looking at the breakdowns in between. And then we look at kind of how that looks comparing them. So we'll look at like total T5s, total power, and then 100 mil plus players, and looking at like what those details or specifics are for each group. And then, of course, we get the response, there it is, the data master confirms it. And it's just, I think the case is it has been that for a couple of the KvK groups. Not all, of course, but for some. And I think probably the most obvious one that sticks out the most is probably the Noir situation, and again, there's others, but I think that's probably been the most popularized at the moment, just because they've been the strongest alliance and were one of the top three strongest kingdoms for a while. And the past second and third season, not this most recent, but you could maybe argue, but definitely the second and third season going past, were just lackluster. There wasn't an overwhelming amount of PvP. There was a very low amount. There was maybe 3 to 5 days total out of a 50-day season that they saw PvP, and that's probably being conservative. The matchups obviously weren't ideal where they could have been, and you would just imagine that if you're the number one alliance and you're one of the top 3 kingdoms in the game, you would hopefully be wanting to try and have as much PvP as possible. Like, if not, why are you training that many troops? Why are you spending that amount of money to have the best, if not the top endgame stuff, if you're not willing to go and use it and fight out in the field? And this obviously doesn't just apply to Noir, but it applies to other alliances and kingdoms where if you fall into this, you probably should start seriously reevaluating, like, is this the alliance for me? And potentially, is this the kingdom for me? And so these, I think, and then you get to the most recent season where it's, kind of the whole Noir versus Echo thing, and I'll just basically kind of give you the cliff notes. Number one, and this is because what I want to point out, I also reached out to all the leadership teams in that KvK, and I asked them for feedback on how the pre-KvK diplomacy went before matchups were publicly announced. And there's probably 3 takeaways from this, and we did a video on it. But number one is that all the kingdoms and alliances that joined, nobody submitted an actual union group plan. Or, hey, this is who should work with who. No, ally suggestions were provided. Number 2, nobody provided any data out of everyone in that group in that specific Discord for the KvK diplomacy to give evidence or any kind of support that said, well, this is why we think these matchups should work. And then number 3, and depending on how big of a takeaway you want to make this, is that we know for a fact that Noir and GG basically preformed allies as kingdom allies before they came to the KvK Discord, the KvK Discord. And so, who knows if anyone else did? Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But the fact is not every single kingdom and not every single alliance within those kingdoms, for the top alliance usually, came to the table with honest and earnest intentions, right? And maybe some did, maybe some didn't. Well, we know some didn't, but I'm sure there's some that did. But the idea being is that not everyone came with a pure open mind of saying, okay, let's try to figure this out to make it the best possible KvK we can for our players, and not just make it about us and looking for a win or potentially looking for an easy fight. The number one focus here should be, how can we get the most amount of PvP and the most amount of fun out of this season for all the players that are going to be in this KvK, not just for ours and our alliance, but for others as well. And that, I think, was probably the most disheartening part for me, hearing that. Anyways, let's go ahead and start giving this a listen.
Subscribe to the channel. I always use timestamps. As I wanted to talk about the direction the game is headed in. And a part of the motivation for this was that I was in Discord and there was an interesting conversation that went down. And I sort of realized that I have some unique perspective into the direction this game will go, because this is not my first city building war game. In fact, I've now been playing Rise of Kingdoms for 6 years, and the patterns we're seeing here are exactly the same to what we saw in Rise of Kingdoms, and let me explain. There's a couple things that happened when Rise of Kingdoms entered into the new world of having KvKs, much like you see here, where you enter into KvK, you can migrate to any server in the game if you wanted to, pretty much. They have to be endgame servers, and there's a bunch of patterns, okay? Let me talk about what those patterns were. When global migration opened up in Rise of Kingdoms, there was an intense amount of concentration of power into a small number of kingdoms. Those kingdoms and their continued existence was based purely off of wins and losses. And eventually, they were just collecting fighters because they were the biggest and the baddest. But at some point, people realized those kingdoms weren't actually taking real fights, and the fighters all left. This is true in Call of Dragons and will happen here too, where the strongest kingdoms in the game are still too focused on winning and not focused enough on setting up the hardest fight possible that is also winnable for themselves. This is what the best kingdoms in Rise of Kingdoms do, is they hunt those wins, but they also hunt for real fights. And there's a reason why I think in this game that hasn't happened yet, and the same was true for Rise of Kingdoms, sort of, and I'll explain. In this
So I think this part really further doubles down on what I was just talking about in regards to some kingdoms that will be looking for easier fights rather than difficult ones. And now that I think about it, another name that comes to mind is TA. And I've talked about them, right? The Avengers early on, they started off in Kingdom 2, right? In the beta, second kingdom to be released. And after they basically went through a whirlwind of what happened in that season in the home kingdom, we've done a number of videos covering that, they emerged victorious in the end. And there has been a number of KvKs where at the time, it could be viewed that they took easier matchups that were more advantageous for them just so they could get the KvK win, rather than taking a challenging matchup that really allowed for it to be, well, we could win or they could win, right? And it's either side really has an equal opportunity. And that's kind of what Chiz is talking about, along with situations that we've seen before. And this isn't to say that, again, every KvK group or every kingdom and every alliance is taking this approach, but there are some that have. And we've covered that in a number. And again, that's hopefully one of the things that I want to be able to do a lot more, especially now that we have the data bot up and running, and with the great job that Rich has been doing on that. And we'll have a link to that in the Discord down below. So with this idea of let's go in and let's be transparent. Let's look at what the potential matchups are going to be, and or let's talk about the matchups the day after they're announced. So like trying to get a video out within 24 hours because we already have the data pulled, and it's just a matter of like plugging in the data here and figuring out what the matchups and figuring out like what the best matchups could be based on the kingdoms that are going to be in that KvK group, and then putting that video out before they potentially announce who they're going to be working with, so we can kind of like either get ahead of it or around the same time. And we give people an opportunity to see, like, this is what the best matchup would be based on starting position, based on T5 breakdown, based on total power, total fighting power, based on 100 mil plus players on which sides, etc. Right? Maybe even like the most amount, like the mana gained between the end of a KvK before the start of the next one. Whatever factors we could really apply, because to me, I feel like that would be one of the best ways to just put everything out there. All the cards are on the table, and then the community can see for themselves, okay, here's all the data, Boss has done all the work, or whomever has, and this is what the most fair and balanced matchup would be. And then are they meeting that or are they not? And I think that would be very indicative of, are we looking for easier wins or are we looking for challenging matchups? And the problem is that nobody's really done that. Like, you don't really have this level. Like, I'll give a shout out to Just Kill Him, to Remy, because he's done some PvP content for his group. Even Princess, who's another COD content creator, she's done stuff for EIS. But for me, you know, I very much like to kind of try to do things holistically, covering game wide. And so I just think, to me, that feels like one of the potential solutions to that is that if people's, I don't want to say business, but if their KvK group is publicly put out there and it's like, here's all the data, here's what the best matchup would be, at least statistic wise. And I'm not saying that has to be the only metric, because obviously people still have to show up and you still have to look at activity trends and a number of other things. That could at least be one good stepping stone for us trying to get the best matchups possible. And then the players in those alliances can hold their leadership teams accountable, at least when it comes to, well, why are we not doing this matchup, right? Or at least, why was this matchup not considered? And then hopefully the leadership teams would have good answers.
This game, before you get to Season of Strife, before you can do sort of global migration, bringing in candidates from all over the game, you are fighting for your survival. You fight for your survival in a home kingdom, and you fight for your survival in the subsequent seasons. And players can migrate, last I checked, at least when I did this the first time around, 2 other kingdoms that are in a season with you, right? So this season 1, season 2 area, there's a lot that goes down, okay?
And just to give a brief add-on to what Chiz was saying. So the first part is correct. You can migrate to any kingdom that is in the same season as you are, but specifically, you can migrate to any kingdom that is in the pre-war phase, and migration has to be open. So usually once a kingdom finishes KvK, you will go to the pre-war phase / back to your home kingdom, and usually have about a 24-hour window or cooldown timer on average until you can then migrate. And you can migrate, even if you're in a KvK and you want to leave that KvK, you can go to a kingdom in pre-war. Or if you're in pre-war, you can go to another kingdom in pre-war. So again, just wanted to add on that piece just so it is complete.
And survival is key. And when this is your world, and that was the case for everyone playing this game, for like the first year the game was out, making sure you win is critical. And there's 2 types of seasons you take. There's seasons where there are opponents that are super powerful. You need to punch your hardest. You need to have saved up resources. You need to be ready to go all out and have accumulated stuff. And there are seasons where you prepare. Okay? And so depending on who you're up against, you're either up against a worthy opponent and you create a great fight that season, or you're not. It's not a big fight. There's no big names there, and you take an easier season. Okay? And that is what you had to do if you wanted to survive, because when you got up against a group that was going to threaten your existence, you had to have your maximum punching strength. So people have wrongfully, in my opinion, accused BDO when I...
Okay, so before we get to that potential gem That's coming up. This is an interesting perspective from Chiz on Rock, and I can understand it because I have heard of kingdoms that do this. However, the one thing I will say that I think COD differs in a little bit, obviously with things like the free healing and what is believed to now be able to recoup, and let me give a very specific example. I've never heard of a situation where a kingdom is not able to recover their full power from once the KvK is basically over, which most KvKs, if not all KvKs, are not having high, intense PvP fights up until the very last day. Usually the last week to maybe 2 weeks, it's probably already decided, or at least a number of days after final zone has been opened, up until maybe the last week of the KvK. And usually around that time, it's done, so you've already started healing, if not before then. And then you're also healing when you're in home kingdom. So the only real kind of hard negative would be if you've lost a lot of troops, but most of the time it's usually going to fall on the mid to high spenders, who are probably going to be doing a lot of those pass rallies, garrison defenses. Same thing for bastions as well, and then potential any city hits that happen throughout a season. And so because of that, I would argue that you still could have good fights in every KvK, unless, and I'll just put an asterisk here as well, unless the people that are in the KvK, based on the alliances that are there, and you're looking at all the stats and data, there's just absolutely no way that you're going to get anything close to a fair matchup. However, the only way to really show that would be if someone's done the data across a lot of KvKs, and sadly I haven't. I wish I was doing it day one. I wish I had this dang data bot day one. So shout out to Rishi. And I think that would be the one way to really showcase it, because otherwise you would basically be fully healed, minus any deads that you had to retrain for the players that were affected, of course, and being able to be in a situation where at that point you can go ahead and be back at full strength, and then you're good to go for the next KvK.
Say, that in the end game, top tier kingdoms are supposed to take these big fights. They point to these seasons that we had, specifically one season that we had, before we got to that state of the game. And they're like, well, you took an easy season over a year ago. And it's like, yeah, dude, the game state was different, bro. In a world in which you can only migrate in the people around you, and you have to fight who you're up against, it's a completely different world. The way the matchmaking works now, the way these seasons of Strife work, the way that global migration works, it's a totally different ballgame. So what I'm trying to say, maybe not so elegantly, as I record this late at night, is that the direction the game will head is that the current big kingdoms will need to either actually deliver real fights, or the real fighters will start to go other places, and the real long-lasting kingdoms will emerge. There are several ingredients that will be critical to that, beyond actually being a fighter kingdom. And one of those elements is actually still a big concern for a lot of players in this game, and it's accountability. Weirdly enough, players of this game are terrified of a dead troop accountability. And it's funny because, I don't think I have particularly high dead troop count, but now that bastions are a mechanic in this game, it is absolutely critical that players send their troops into those bastions to lose them. And it's funny.
So to pause here for a sec, what I will say is, if we're looking at dead troop comparisons, so I did this data pool where we looked at the top 25 players that have the most amount of deads. And we can go down as well, and further, I should say, down this list to see, but I'll show you right now where, I think I put it up here, right? So this is the top 25 players, and you can see at number 25, Love S, right, is at a little over 5 million for dead troops. So it just comes in at ranked 390 for overall deads, and that's out of the top 10,000 players in the game. That's still pretty good overall. Now, what I will say is that when we're looking at deads itself, it is... I will only briefly say that my view on deads is I just don't think that we should be having something like bastions in the game maybe this early. And it's not to say that I don't think they shouldn't add or shouldn't come in. But I think that there could be other ways to go about it. I mean, I think one of the things they've been doing with policies, which I think used to be called cross swords, and now it might be bitter end, and some of the policies you can take as well that will basically allow for you to swap having lower hospital caps or taking deads when you're getting buffs as well. So that's kind of a trade-off. And I think those are interesting ways to go about it, where you're getting, these small buff increases, even though arguably if you're comparing yourself with other players and everyone's stats are basically maxed out, it, I guess, kind of forces people to take that if they're at least willing to incur deads at that point. And, I think we saw that pretty early on when, Neff was taking that, because he just had so many troops at that point. It's, why not add a little bit more percentage damage to maybe get some better trades here. And now it's become, I think, a little bit more common, at least for players, like I said, that are at the top, have troops to spare, have kind of a consistent spending budget that they're able to use in order to not get too low per se, right? I think those would be some common denominators. Let's continue.
Because we wanted to go in the direction of BDO of requiring dead troops. I don't have that many, in my opinion. I should go get more. I had, I think, a pretty high amount in this last season relative to the amount of dead troop opportunity we had. But that almost entirely came from basically rallying cities and turning on that skill. I can't remember the name now, where you take dead troops. Anyways, what I'm trying to say is that dead troops will be a healthy requirement of every kingdom at some point in this game. The only reason it isn't is because there's enough kingdoms that tolerate not having that, such that all the players are like, well, why would I migrate to a kingdom that has a dead troop requirement? None of the other kingdoms have it. So at some point, one of the top tier kingdoms is actually going to get, how do I want to say this in a politically correct way? We'll actually have the courage of leadership to say, every single player will contribute a certain amount of dead troops based on their power, or they can't stay here. And the reason why every single player should want that is because you want to know that everyone else on your team is going to commit the same way you will. And a part of the reason that BDO is in some ways a unusually, I think, alarming opponent to fight is because we will send it, bro. We will send it. You want to lose troops? We do. Right? We will send it, whether it's rallying or garrisoning. We will kill off our troops. We will throw down if the strategic objective is there, and that's what we're committing to. We're committed. We will go for it. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that eventually there will be a requirement in this game, upheld by players in the top kingdoms in the game, to contribute minimum amounts of dead troops based on your power. It's an inevitability, but the fact that people are so allergic to it now is so fascinating and sort of points to a couple things. First of all, obviously...
Okay, so the dead troop thing, I will say that I do tend to agree here, and my explanation, I guess, would just be a little different. I would just simply say that once you hit a certain power, like an example, once you're at 150 mil, maybe 100 mil plus, and you at least have, right? Because I think the most important thing we have to look at is how many total troops do you have, and how many versions of that, how many marches, instances can you fill out in the field? An example, if you're at a 300k troop cap per march, you have 5 marches, that's 1.5 million troops. If you only have 1.5 million troops, would you ask someone to take deads when they're not able to field up to 5 marches? Maybe, but I would argue probably not. If you're at, now maybe, and I say maybe because what if they're only using 2 marches, right? Maybe they're not using all up to 5, right? There can be some variations, but I'm just speaking in very simple terms. Let's say you're in a situation where everyone in this example should be using up to 5 marches to field. Having 1.5 million troops, which is the exact amount you need to field 5 marches, it doesn't make sense to ask people to take deads at that point. Now let's say you have 3 million troops available. And again, you can assume it's T5, T4, whatever it may be. But let's just say you have 3 million troops available. You can field 2 instances of up to 5 marches. Okay? Would you ask someone to take dead troops? Maybe. right? I would say a little bit more than 1.5, but I would still argue on like the probably not side. And that's just because you have to worry about being able to field marches and troops in the open field, and taking those sevs and being able to recover them, along with the amount of resources that it'll take, depending on if you only have that amount of T5 troops. Either you're a newish account or you're probably more on the free-to-play low-spend side. Okay, so now let's say you have 4.5 or 6 million troops. Okay, now you're getting more into this realm of like, okay, I can see now you taking some debts. And I guess it's just a matter of trying to figure out what that threshold number is. What is that number that you want people, like let's say anyone, like an example of this, let's say anyone over 100 million power, we require you to take dead troops, to where the amount of dead troops you take would put you back to 100 million power. And I'm not saying everyone, I'm just giving a broad example, right? You can set that at whatever you would. But let's say that's the case. Or let's say that you ask people, okay, well, what is your average spending budget, right? And again, if people are truthful with that information, maybe you factor that in. Maybe you factor in their average rate of growth. And maybe some people, you would say, okay, well, if you're like a mid-high spender, maybe we say, okay, well, yeah, you should be willing to go down to 100 million power or 150 million power for the amount of deads you take to put out there because of the amount of troops that you trained. And then maybe for people that might be more low spends, maybe we say, okay, well, maybe we'll leave you at 125 mil if you're above that, or 115 or 120, whatever it may be. Point is that you have to figure that out. And I think that's really where Chiz is going with this. And that's why I do tend to agree here that I think it makes sense, because if one of the things that you really get a big morale boost from is your strongest people, or the players that are in unique positions to be your captain or your lead or the focal point of whether it's open field, if it's rallying, if it's garrison, if it's war leading, etc. Like, it's important that you see those people out fighting, because that can instill a level of motivation, a level of confidence and comfortability in up to all the players in your alliance and or your kingdom going out there and fighting hand in hand with you. Let's continue.
Obviously, in this game, you want to have a lot of troops because it increases your free healing. And so there's a weird push-pull here that is sort of fighting that direction that needs to happen for healthy communities and kingdoms. Because look, like, people should want to be in a kingdom that requires dead troops, because then you know everybody is committing. Imagine the opposite world where nobody commits any troops to passes, nobody commits any troops to bastions. You're just going to lose, right? So if committing troops is a requirement for victory, how unfair is it if everybody isn't contributing? Look, it's an unpopular take, okay? And a year from now, we'll point back to this video and be like, I told you so. Because in Rise of Kingdoms, they would laugh you out of the room if you said you were running a top tier kingdom in this game without a dead troop requirement. It is a absolute joke to a Rise of.
And I will say this is probably a pretty accurate-ish take, where Rock is different though from CoD, right? Like, we have the free healing, CoD doesn't, Rock doesn't. And like I talked about before, you can basically get fully healed in your kingdom from the end of a KvK during your time in home kingdom, but very much, and if not definitely before the next KvK starts. And so to me, these are kind of somewhat like, I guess I don't want to say a non-issue, but just more of like, I just don't think it's as big as it is because of the general differences at a foundational level between the two games. But I understand the point coming from how some Rock players and kingdoms may view this. Again, my thing is like, could you actually still fight? Like, it is an interesting question. If your alliance and kingdom did not care about attacking a pass, and you did not care about fighting the bastion, but you were able to build territory to the dragon in the final zone or to key points just as fast, could you survive by holding or winning the open field without attacking your opponent's bastions or your opponent's passes? Like, you were able to get into the next zone that you needed to, but you just had so much field presence and you overwhelmed them through strategy, through activity, power, etc., that it didn't matter. Like, could you do that? I would be very curious for those of you out there if you feel like that could happen. I'd love to know.
The Kingdoms player, okay? Even your casual players would be like, wow, that's crazy. Y'all are nuts. They think you're lunatics how casual you are. Okay, so what I'm driving at here is there will be an accountability elevation And then and only then will these top tier kingdoms that are also seeking out tough fights really emerge. And the third ingredient, okay, accountability for performance, including dead troops, okay, seeking hard fights. Then lastly is going to be really strong leadership that understands what's actually happening. And I can't comment really to other alliances in this regard. I genuinely don't pay much attention to the sort of drama and the other kingdoms in this game and what they're up to. But I thought it was really interesting that a lot of people that don't normally agree with me were like, in the official Discord, they were like, yeah, actually, it is weird that the big kingdoms in this game, maybe they could try to take harder fights. I don't know. I actually thought it was really interesting. The people that normally are like, I disagree with Chisco were like, no, we're in alignment here. So, look, you don't have to like my opinion, but we can just look to the patterns in Rise of Kingdoms, and this game is following those patterns already. And I pointed to that before, and I'll point to it again now very formally in a video that I think those things are coming. Okay. That doesn't mean they have to be there now. I mean, we wanted to have a dead troop requirement and we had to remove it because when your options are to migrate to a kingdom that has a dead troop requirement or a kingdom that doesn't, a lot of people look at that and they freak out. I almost feel like we should have doubled down on the dead troop requirement, but I'm not the guy doing the recruiting, so I wasn't going to be a complainer. And I am happy with our migration in. The other thing that I think is going to be really critical, by the way, for community growth.
And so this one here, right, I think, to be fair, I don't know if it's necessarily that, from what Chiz is saying, that a number of people usually disagree. I think it's that, one, there's usually not... So I think part of it is that there's not usually, on average, a medium to high level of community engagement specifically on the Discord from Chiz, and that's understandable because he's busy, he does a lot, he has a high sub count, he covers multiple games, not only on this channel, but I think he has another channel for... It's like a Brawl Stars thing. I keep forgetting what that game is called, but it's something else. And then on top of that, when a video, and I think it's probably from a couple later videos, or I should say older videos, when he was going through that BDO betrayal, the whole betrayal meta vids were coming out, and it was kind of talking about those seasons, and then there was, oh, well, these are changes I would make to the game. I think it was more around that time when the videos were coming out. And sometimes when you're doing videos and you don't necessarily do a lot of community engagement on the Discord, or maybe joining VCs, and again, all of these are just dependent on what time is available for any creator. I think those are things that can help. And at times, again, videos are what I kind of view as an instance capture, right? It's sometimes when people watch them, if you miss saying something, or if you don't cover something, or if you don't kind of cover yourself in some way, people kind of, I would almost view that as, oh, well, maybe he didn't think of that, or maybe that creator didn't think of that, or why didn't they mention this, right? And it doesn't mean that they don't think that way. Maybe they just forgot to say it. But we're kind of very take it or leave it, or take it at face value creatures in some extent. And so I think for this, when it comes to this idea of not taking dads, or as you said, kind of having, allergic to dads, or BDO needing to have a higher dead requirement that he would have liked. Like I said, I think it really comes down to you just needing to figure out what is the best for your alliance and your kingdom. And I also thought it was an interesting point that he brought up, because I haven't really actually heard a lot of other people mention this, so it's actually refreshing, where when you're looking at migration, there's a number of factors that players will look at before they decide to potentially go somewhere. And if you're disclosing something like, oh, we have a dead troop requirement or we don't, and if so, what is it? How that can be a turnoff to some people, because maybe you want to go somewhere that's really active and you don't have a lot of options, or you don't have a lot of choices. And so, you want to go somewhere, but you just don't want the high dead count. That is something that I think is also just a general factor difference between CoD and...
In this game and the formation of these sort of super kingdoms, which is an inevitability, is that you really need to be able to manage to a decimal point of a very meaningful level of precision is what I'm trying to say, for your migration. Okay. And I keep zooming out because I want to go to the world map and show you migration. But the point I'm making here is that in Rise of Kingdoms, based on the way power works and the power restrictions work, I can tell you exactly with zero hesitation at all how much we can migrate into a kingdom. I can tell you exactly what we can get. And you can do that here using the new functions that are sort of available. I haven't ever done this myself though, so I can't really speak to it in detail, where you like sort of simulate how full your server would be with a migration. But there's a lot more control in the player's hands in Rise of Kingdoms, just based on the way that those systems actually work. And I think that is going to be really important to be able to like really, really clearly define like how you get people into the kingdom. And I think, you know, we have some really good systems that have come a long way already for this game. But purely based off the way the system is designed, I don't know that you can predict in the same way that you could in Rise of Kingdoms. Now, that said, you know, you can simulate what the migration would be. So, you know, that's not a criticism of how it's done in this game. It's just a difference in the way that they're done. All right. So those are the elements that are going to dictate the future for this game and how these super kingdoms are formed.
Yeah, so I think what I'll say here is that I think referring to the migration preview beta feature that we covered and kind of revealed as a first look, where essentially if you are the alliance leader and you are in a different kingdom and you are, let's say you're in Kingdom 1, you want to migrate 30 of your players to Kingdom 2. You have this function or feature where you can click migration preview. It's when you zoom out on the kingdom list and then you click on the kingdom and then there's a migration preview button in the bottom right. And I think Spartan had showed this to me from ANCS. And you click on it and then you can select however many players via a checkbox. And then depending on the players you select, the power that they have, the total players that would be migrating and their total power, it moves this bar. And the bar can move to go from normal to active to crowded to full. And that's based on if you guys all migrated right then and there in that instance, no one else migrated, and based on probably the current factors of that kingdom that's defining its power and its status. And I do think that it is a nice feature. However, what would be even better is if, as a king, like if you're a king or queen, you had the same bar available to you, but based on who you're accepting. So let's say that, number one, my view simply put is that every single player, regardless of their power, if you want to migrate to any kingdom, everyone has to go through a pure accept deny. And then everyone who would be accepted, there needs to be a preview where if you accept this player or if you accept this batch of players, this is how it would move your needle. Or an option for you to multi-accept players via a checkbox. So let's say you want to select multiple players. You should be able to select a checkbox on like 10 incoming players that have applied to migrate, and then it should also give the king a preview bar of if you accept these 10 people or you accept these 5 or 20 or 30, this is where it moves your kingdom into. That I think would be a lot better and something that I hope they will eventually add to King Queen tools. But I do agree here generally with Chiz that it would be nice if they did more in CoD.
Actually, having those elements, the leadership, taking the tough fights, setting the standards for the dead troops, being able to migrate and really detailed level manage your communities is really key. And the other piece of the puzzle, I suppose, for like managing your communities is like, you know, what do you do with people that are in your home kingdom that are not contributors to the kingdom? That is a huge question mark. And I almost feel like, you know, look, the way they solved this in Rise of Kingdoms is with the KvK registration. I would bet you that at some point we might get a KvK registration or equivalent that lets you pick person by person who is or is not a part of that matchmaking power. And matchmaking, you know, rating or however that's done, right? I think that would be a reasonable add. And maybe they, I don't know, yeah, the High King registers the realm for a season of scenario. But I think the High King registers the alliances, specific alliances could be an interesting one. The players would be a real pain. Like, it's a real pain, but you can get very precise. Anyways, hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, throw a like on here. Consider subscribing. The late night.
All right, so last thing we'll comment on, and I love hearing this from Chiz on this one because this is something I've been saying for a while now, is that, and we've talked about this, I've talked about this with the community when we're in the VC on Discord, when I've done videos covering this, is that it, to me, I think one way to improve, I don't know if this is an immediate solve or a long-term solve, but I do think it at least addresses a major part of matchmaking power, rating, MMR, however you want to refer to it as, ELO, is if the High King is able to select, as in a checkbox, when registration comes up, the High King can say, I want this alliance, and this alliance, and he can register as many as he wants. If he wants to register 50 or 100 or every alliance that's in the kingdom, that's fine. It's an up to any amount. And he selects as, I just want to bring in these two, or I want to bring in only one alliance, or I want to bring in these three. And meaning that players have to be in those alliances by the time the registration, or I should say, they need to be in the alliance before the High King submits for registration. Because the moment that they submit, it's locked in. So you have up until that registration window to submit the alliances and the players that are in them, and then they're locked. Not as though they're locked that they can't move alliances afterwards, but just that the total amount of players and the total power that they're bringing into the KvK, those statistics are locked. And also meaning that those are the only players that are going to be able to move between a KvK or go to KvK and back to a home kingdom. Those, I think, are just some important distinctions. But this is something I've been saying for a while, so this is great to hear other people saying this. I love that Chiz is saying this too as well, because I do think that it is one way to address at least going in with an accurate level of power, and also being able to find more accurate matchups. Instead of looking at something like maybe a pure top 300, you're able to go in with something that I think is a little bit more tailor-made and customized per each of the kingdom, that gives a unique number or a unique value identifier to them, and then you can try to match up those unique identifiers with other kingdoms. With that in mind, that's it for me. Actually really liked the takes here on this one. And I always love, I think more importantly, when creators are willing to share their views in more topical discussions. Because for me, I like to do this a lot outside of the other content that I cover. And so being able to hear how other people think, I love just kind of knowing how people work, because I think it can also lead us to having really good, enticing, and really engaged conversations. So good stuff. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. It's going to do it for me. As always, until next time, we'll catch you later.